just a few more seconds. Okay, well, hello and welcome to our webinar, Pop Culture Strategies at Your Fingertips. I'm Mike Jackson, Media Strategist at the Opportunity Agenda, and I will be your moderator today. The Opportunity Agenda is a social justice communication lab. We work with partners to move hearts and minds toward lasting policy and culture change. Today, we're very glad to be offering a walkthrough presentation of Pop Culture Strategies at Your Fingertips, which explores the different ways that advocates, cultural strategists, and influencers are using pop culture for social change. So we're joined today by 3 speakers, and I'd like to thank them for their time with us today. They are Janelle Trivets, the Creative Engagement Coordinator here at the Opportunity Agenda, Joyce Dutta, Story Shift Strategist at Working Films, Ishita Srilastava, the Director of Culture Change at Caring Across Generations. We'll be taking questions after each speaker, so feel free to enter any questions you have into the questions function. It should be on like the right side of your GoToWebinar panel. You can also join the conversation online as well by using the hashtag PopCultureTips, one more time, PopCultureTips, or by tweeting us at OpAgenda. So with that, let's get started. A big thank you for everyone joining us today, and a special thank you again to each of our speakers. So our first speaker is Janelle. Janelle?
Hi, thanks, Michael. So I am going to go a little bit more into depth about pop culture strategies. Pop culture includes film, television, sports, music, fashion, tech, and media, and it reaches mass audiences. There is a growing field of advocates, activists, cultural strategists, artists, and researchers who are all experimenting with different pop culture strategies, trying to find the ways that pop culture can be used to change hearts, minds, and behavior. This chart shows the major sectors of work within the field of pop culture strategies, but think of it more as an ecosystem. A lot of organizations are engaging in multiple strategies within pop culture to try to change how people feel about their issue or community. But each of these strategies represents a body of work in which people have developed research, tactics, and expertise. Industry strategy, I'm just going to go through and give a brief explanation of each of these. Industry strategy is how people are transforming the entertainment industry. And pipeline strategy is how people are helping get diverse emerging artists and producers into the industry. Content strategy is how people are creating and activating social change stories. Platform strategy is how people are disseminating social change content. Influencer strategy is how people are working with influencers to reach mass audiences and leverage their influence. And fandom strategy is how people are activating fans to work for social change. Now, there's only 3 strategies that I want to focus on in this webinar, and those are industry, content, and influencer strategies. And we're focusing on those because we've heard from many of you that these are the strategies that people are most interested in learning more about, and they're the strategies that the largest number of our partners are engaged in. As I go through each strategy, I'll give you a few examples of how people in the field are engaging and having impact within this work, and then I'll offer some tips for how advocates can start to engage with each pop culture strategy too. So we'll start with industry strategy. Industry strategy is about transforming the entertainment industry. And one example of how that's done is by working with writers' rooms to influence storylines. Caring Across Generations, who you'll hear about later in the webinar, is doing that work. National Domestic Workers Alliance, Color of Change, and many others. That's where they build relationships with folks who are creating the storylines that you see in Hollywood in order to seed new narratives or influence their approach to the existing storylines that they are working on. We also have educating industry decision makers to transform from within, and Harness is doing work that is a organization made up of various influencers, including America Ferrera and others, who are going into the Hollywood industry and talking with various professionals, from showrunners to executives, trying to have a conversation about increasing diverse hiring, casting, and other practices. Then we have holding the industry accountable for its programming. There are various ways folks do that, but I want to hold up a couple of them that involves research and analysis, a very important aspect of the field. The Opportunity Agenda, we ourselves have done a media analysis of immigrant representation in popular TV shows. And that was picked up by a lot of different journalists when they wanted to talk about the impact of representation in television. And also GLAAD does a lot of work around researching and tracking how the GLBTQIA communities are represented in television. They activate that research then by showing award shows, giving awards to people who do the work correctly in their mind, and also they do a network grading sheet where folks can basically look to see how a given network has done in representation in the previous year, and they can activate or participate in any kind of social media campaign around that. Next, we have mobilizing audiences for industry changes. So Color of Change has done a lot of work around this, as well as many others, where they will do petitions and also other kinds of grassroots organizing and social media campaigns to target industry, either networks or elements of the industry. You see here, this petition is for ESPN, in order to organize folks not in the industry to put pressure on an industry to make a particular change. We also saw that type of strategy with Oscars So White that April Rain started, that called out the Academy of Motion Pictures for not having diverse nominees for the Oscars. And I want to talk about tips. So you all are not necessarily in the position within organizations, I'm sure some of you are, to take very complicated actions or to build all the relationships you need to get into a writer's rooms. But there are things that you can do. So the first thing is to track important industry moments like season premieres, award shows, or other moments where a lot of attention is going to be paid to that particular industry. Then you can use those industry moments and any new research that comes out, it's another thing you can track, as a hook in order to build off of that, to comment on social media. You can write op-eds. You can, as you saw with Color of Change, do petitions in order to try and transform that industry. Next, you can connect your issues to industry programming. That's a really good way to generate interest even within the folks who are normally your base, and also to widen your base out a little bit. Again, social media plays a really big role here. It's a very important tool to be able to speak to a wider audience. And so this is a great way to do that. Like if there's a show coming up that you know that deals with immigration, even if it's not saying exactly the thing that you would say, you can use it as a hook, build off the attention toward that show, and speak about your issue on whatever platforms you have access to. The next tip is to uplift good content. If there is a show or something that you saw in a sporting event that you feel represents your issue or your community or a particular story that you want to get out further, then you can push that out as well and comment on it. The next is that there is strength in numbers. And that's just a quick tip to think about who you have access to within your partnerships and allies and members already. And that by generating collective action to do one of these things, you can get it to go farther. And so if you're trying to influence the industry, remember that one voice can be effective depending on if something happens to go viral in the way that Oscars so white, but that's not something to count on. And you can amplify your own issue by having multiple people repeat it in that space. So if, for example, if everybody decides to tweet around a particular season premiere, connecting a particular issue or a framework around how they want a particular story told to that particular show, you're more likely to have that go farther. And particularly if you want to influence and give the industry feedback in a way around how that is being presented, and you say, no, you need to change this, or yes, you're doing it right. Having multiple people do that, or multiple organizations and a wide variety of voices doing that, is more likely to have a bit of more of an impact than if you were just doing it yourself within your one organization. Next, we have content strategy. That is creating and activating stories. The reason that you might want to think about doing this is because if you tell your own stories, you can control how your story is told. And also you have a potential of having impactful stories that reach wider audiences. One way folks do this is by just telling powerful stories. The photo you see here is from a game, from Games for Change, which encourages any kind of web-based or Nintendo. I'm dating myself by referencing Nintendo here, but any kind of game that has some kind of social change impact. But storytelling is ultimately multimedia, and so you can do that through everything from films to comic books to Twitter memes to phone apps, as well as games. People also build off what's popular. So if they don't want to create their own story, they can also look at the stories that are coming out and try and engage people through them, again, using it as a hook. So this example that you see is The Help. That was a big movie that came out some years ago, and the National Domestic Workers Alliance took advantage of the content. The movie itself is about domestic workers and the racism they experienced in the 1950s, but National Domestic Workers connected it to the plight of domestic workers today and created a whole social media campaign called Be the Help, where they had people tweet out how they wanted to support domestic workers, and also shared video interviews with domestic workers to get the issue to be picked up in the media, which it was, and to get people more familiar with issues and thinking about how they relate and how the domestic workers in their lives how they could be a support to them. And it was very successful and got a lot of support from even the actors in the film who talked about the campaign and gave it some shine. Next, we have activating audiences around stories. So this is Shore Stories. This is an effort of Working Films, which is a partner in StoryShift, and Joycia will be talking about StoryShift's work later. But this is an example of when you can use stories to help organize folks around a particular issue or community. So this Shore Stories was an initiative using documentary film to build opposition to offshore drilling. And there were 6 short films that were used in conjunction with organizing efforts. There was shown to residents of different shoreline communities, exposing them to powerful stories and connecting them to actions that they could take. So even if you yourselves cannot make a documentary film, or make a game, you can map pop culture habits. Who is watching what? So within your own organization, I'm sure there are people who probably go home and watch television or participate in some kind of comic book fandom and really keep up on what the latest comic books are doing. And so once you do that, you can carve out space in your organization to discuss trending digital content. So that means if there is a hot topic that's happening in the television world that relates to poverty and you're working on issues around poverty, then maybe by making space, you can think about how you could be commenting on it, how you could be, even if it's just a tweet that goes out, that if by connecting, again, by connecting, you can uplift and amplify your own work and generate more interest in the folks who would be interested in the show but may not have heard about your work or may not normally think they would want to read about it that particular day. But by having a pop culture hit, they're more likely to do that. And so build off of pop culture content that already exists. So again, like if you are tracking and having space to talk about it, then hopefully you will know when something big does hit, or be able to anticipate when, for example, you know the season premiere of a show that is relevant is about to come out, and you can plan in advance and think about, maybe we want to do a little social media campaign around that. Also, you can think about partnering with artists to create your own content that centers your stories. Maybe it's not a full-on documentary film, maybe it's a short film that goes up on your website, maybe it's a graphic meme that shows your communities or shows your issues in a different way that's a little more artistic or a little more poetic. And just as a note that when you're partnering with artists, really try to think about finding ways to hire them and not just asking them to do free work. Think of them like a graphic designer or anybody else you might hire to help with that, but they can be a very powerful way to make sure that your stories are told. Also, it can be a way to tap into emerging artists who may one day have a larger platform. Not to say that they're going to be celebrities in Hollywood necessarily, but they may eventually have a following, and bringing them in early to learn about your work can be very powerful. Finally, reference pop culture storylines or symbols in your actions. So if you're doing protests or demonstrations, using symbols can energize and inspire people. For example, if you remember the Women's March, their image is Princess Leia from Star Wars with the tagline, "Join the Resistance." And that became a very common image that really was both slightly humorous and also people found very inspiring, and they connected to that because they're familiar with that storyline and it has power for them. Next, we're looking at influencer strategy. So influencer strategy is basically just leveraging influence of folks who have influence. Influence, here I'm defining as people who can affect the behavior, thinking, or like feelings of the folks that follow them. So it could be anything from a pop star to a chef who's very popular in your neighborhood, but who talks about different issues or does things with this restaurant that is supportive of a particular culture. Anything where folks look to them to see how they're thinking about an issue, and that might influence the way that they're thinking or feeling about an issue. One example of this is raising the profile of an issue to a wider audience. So Drug Policy Alliance partnered with Dream Hampton, who produced a really wonderful video that Jay-Z narrated and that was drawn by Molly Crabapple, looking at the way that youth are criminalized and how drugs, now that marijuana is being made legal, looking at how that is actually still criminalizing folks and benefiting the folks who weren't involved in those industries to begin with. That is a very simplified way of a very complex and wonderful video. So look it up if you have a chance. But it really had a huge impact. It trended online. It was published through the New York Times and became one of the most watched videos that New York Times had ever put out. We also have raising money, something folks do a lot with influencers. So Revolutions Per Minute, which is a very wonderful group that partners with musicians, helps musicians think about what they're passionate about, then connects them to social justice organizations, and also helps them hone and think about it complicates their understanding often of the issues and helps them become a more thoughtful partner, and then helps them structure concerts so that they can raise money for those organizations that they get connected to. And folks also develop the leadership and advocacy of influencers. One example of this is RISE, the Ross Initiative in Sports for Equality, who works with sports athletes, coaches, and administrators at every level to stand up against racism and advance the national conversation around race. They teach advocacy skills to athletes, and they help them connect to the organizations working on the issues they care about. They educate student athletes and sports professionals on the history of racism, and they create athlete-led social media campaigns to spark dialogue. So some tips for those of you who are more starting out but are interested in this field. You can build relationships with the influencers you have access to. So again, there might be a local celebrity chef in your city, or someone, an artist who makes the round and has a bit of a following, or a personality on social media that in their normal life, that not online, they aren't very well known, but online, a lot of folks follow them and listen to what they say. Meet influencers where they're at. So you have to think like an organizer. You need to build on the pre-existing interests and passions of an influencer. Create a leadership development arc. Like, what are the first easy asks you can make from somebody, and have a plan to continue to engage and build the influencer's knowledge and leadership over time. And follow and engage with influencers on social media, even the folks that you can't reach. Beyonce, that's maybe a higher level, but there are various influencers, artists, directors who are very active on social media. And if you continually engage and follow them, you might open up opportunities to be communicating with them, but at the very least to be engaging their fans who are also following them and having online conversations with or about them. And also build off of influencer actions. If you see somebody like Beyonce's amazing halftime show where she referenced Black Panthers and was a wonderful display commenting on racial justice in the United States, you can talk about that and build off the fact that that happened, like a celebrity said something or celebrity did something that relates to your issue. Make sure to engage with that, whether through you could try to write an op-ed, you could try to write a blog post, you could try and build a mini social media campaign around it. There are a variety of ways you can think about how to do that. But if you do that, be careful, this final tip, be careful to uplift the action rather than the person, because people are complicated beings. They rarely do everything and correctly is the way that we would hope for, which means that when someone does something great, embrace and celebrate the good action that they do, but avoid embracing the person as the embodiment of goodness, because you never know if a little down the line, they might slip up or say or do something that is not exemplary. Finally, I wanted to offer some resources to you that might be helpful in a journey to try and engage pop culture a little more deeply. So the Opportunity Agenda has a report that I mentioned, Power of Pop, Media Analysis of Representations of Immigrants in Popular TV Shows. At the end of it, it has a pretty extensive list of possible recommendations for how to think about engaging the industry in a way around these questions of representation in a way that is accessible to folks who aren't able to build those deeper relationships with industry professionals. We also have a really excellent guide in the form of And Actions guide, the Pop Culture Works for Social Change. They really break down different ways that you can engage with pop culture from a 101 level, for everything from just using a shared pop culture name, like the Death Star that was in a bill, to more complex ways of integrating it into your campaigns. But all of it is very good advice. And then Liz Mann, Unbound Philanthropy, and the Nathan Cummings Foundation collaborated to put out a series of reports called Pop Justice, Social Justice and the Promise of Pop Culture Strategies, where they really investigate what is happening in the field of pop culture strategies. They have some excellent case studies. They map out who's doing what in the pop culture industry so you can get a better sense of it. So if you're looking to go much deeper with pop culture strategies, I would recommend taking a look at those reports and taking some time to read them. And finally, you'll hear about, sorry. Go back to the slide. There we go. Finally, we have StoryShift.net's framework. You'll be hearing about the StoryShift project later from Joyisha, but they have a really excellent principles and praxis document looking at how people can be thinking about making art and making stories in a way that's accountable and respectful. But you'll be hearing more about that later. So now I'm going to turn it back to Michael. Thank you.
Thank you for that great presentation, Janelle. And I had a Nintendo as a kid, so I am totally with you on that. Ishita, I wanted to ask your cultural work, right? So within Caring Across Generations engages multiple pop culture strategies. So I'm wondering if you can maybe tell us a little about the Storyline Partners Project and how you're working with Hollywood writers' rooms, to tell more inclusive stories.
Sure. Hi. I hope everyone can hear me. My name is Ishita Srivastav, and as Michael said, I work at an organization called Caring Across Generations. We're a national movement of families, caregivers, people with disabilities, and aging Americans, and we're working to transform the way we care for one another in this country. We do that through kind of online and grassroots organizing and culture change work. And we're trying to kind of shift how we value caregiving. And we're also calling for policy solutions that allow us all to age well and live with dignity. So that's a little background on Caring Across. I'm super excited to be here. Thanks so much to the Opportunity Agenda for putting together this webinar. I'm going to share, so I head up the culture change work at Caring Across. I'm going to share a little bit of our culture change work that is specifically fits into what Janelle talked about as industry strategy. So, working directly with the entertainment industry to kind of influence stories that, storylines in television and film, and seed new stories. And I'm going to actually talk about that through a new initiative that Caring Across Generations is a part of, called Storyline Partners. Caring Across has been doing consulting work for a couple of years. We worked on a film a couple of years ago called Still Alice, where we consulted on a character who was a family caregiver. But something that's happened over the years is that there's a bunch of organizations that have been doing this work. I'd say some for a very long time, some more recently. But one of the things that has come up is that there isn't really a very sort of established process for how organizations like all of ours that represent different communities and issues can actually work with the entertainment industry. And so last year, we were kind of a bunch of organizations that have been doing this work were kind of pulled together by the Pop Culture Collaborative, which is a new funding body for pop culture work. And we actually came together to form a new initiative called Storyline Partners that we're a part of. So next slide, please. So Storyline Partners is a collective currently comprised of 9 organizations. We collaborate with the entertainment industry to seed new narratives in television film, as well as consult on existing narratives. We aim to increase the visibility of people who are both misrepresented and underrepresented in pop culture, especially television, by fostering nuanced, authentic, and dynamic stories that uphold the dignity of communities and accurately represent the world we live in. Next slide, please. So currently, we are 9 different organizations. You can see on your screen. We're organizations that have been engaging with writers and producers to influence storylines in different ways, as well as harness that Janelle mentioned earlier, Color of Change, National Domestic Workers Alliance, all of whom kind of have a variety of ways that they engage with the industry. So some of them do more work on the pipeline, some do more work on kind of the balance of power in the industry. But this initiative is really focused on providing sort of intersectional consulting to writers' rooms on the stories of the communities that we all represent. So we currently have 9 members. We're actually really excited to be able to grow and to bring other organizations into our fold so we can represent a wide range of issues. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry, one more. So, a little bit of kind of how we think about the impact of this kind of work and how we fit in to the work that, that different organizations are doing in Hollywood is around, so obviously we represent a range of people in the social justice space who are advocates. We consult specifically with like content creators and content distributors in Hollywood. So what that means is like we consult at all stages of production of a television show, so from early stages to the end when it's actually being distributed. The way we see it is kind of having a twofold impact. One is, of course, we want to reach fans of the shows who are kind of like how we think about the fuzzy middle. They're people that are persuadable. They're people that are like amenable to thinking about the communities we represent in the ways that we want, but they may not have had the exposure to, for example, a story of a domestic worker and really understanding what it means to be a domestic worker in this country right now. And so they're people that we think we can really win over with a deep, long-term storyline that stretches across ideally a couple of seasons. But we also know that like representation is super important. So it's not just these people that we can move. We also, we know that like the representation is really important to the communities that we represent. And so it's really great when people can see kind of deep, authentic and nuanced representations of their own stories on screen. And so that's really important to us. And that feedback loop is very important. And so we make sure that we bring that, the feedback from the communities we represent into our consulting. And those voices and those stories are really important to our consulting work. Next slide, please. So just quickly, the kinds of consulting that Storyline Partners provides is expertise in sort of critical and often urgent issues around kind of all the issues that are really important right now. I think one of the things that is really crucial to why we came together as a collective is that we know that characters in stories are not single issues. Characters we all hold multiple identities and our issues and identities overlap. And so by coming together as a collective, we can like provide consulting that is like deeply intersectional and really like resonates with how writers and creative people and artists write their characters. And so, for example, if somebody has, Caring Across focuses on the issues of aging, caregiving, domestic workers, and sort of all the ways in which those interact and increasing the visibility of those. And so suppose there's like an older character on a TV show and they have a family member who helps take care of them. As we consult on that, I might introduce the idea of a care worker who is undocumented and suggest to the show that maybe they want to explore a smaller character who's like a care worker who happens to be undocumented because so many of the care workers in this country are undocumented. I would then quickly bring in the National Domestic Workers Alliance and Defined American who really focus on domestic workers and undocumented folks, and they could, come in and we could all consult as a group. So that's just like one of the really important ways that we think it's great for us to come together. Obviously, we connect the entertainment industry with people from our communities directly, but we also, in order to make sure that that's like that communication is sort of safe for the people in our communities and that it's done in a way that is like helpful for everyone, we kind of work as a bridge. Next slide. And one of the things we want to do, and so we're pretty new. This collective has been around about 6 months at this point. One of the things we want to do is really create some digital resources so that we can both have like a rapid response mechanism for writers in the industry who need help quickly, who need like, consulting in the form of maybe an online chat or a hotline. Then we also want to have like a sort of a directory of experts as well as stories that we can easily sort of connect to people in the industry. Next slide. I'm not going to go into detail, but I just wanted to share that, like I said earlier, consulting with the industry can happen at various stages. It's really great to get in very early so that we can consult on a pitch of a show or a treatment of a show where we have the opportunity to seed like ideas that they may not have thought of yet. But then obviously deep into production, we do script reviews, we do set visits, we bring in community voices, we look at rough cuts. And then at the release stage, of course, there's ways to engage that are around, like Janelle talked about, social media campaigns that like go alongside the release of a show, or providing talking points to the actors in a show, like the way Janelle talked about the example of The Help. So these are just this is some detail into how we consult on a show. Yeah, I think I'm going to stop there. I think I'm going to stop there talking about storyline partners, and hand it back to you, Michael.
Sure. Thank you very, very, very much. So we know many advocates who want to learn more about how to influence a storyline to coming out of Hollywood. So I'm curious, what lessons have you learned about building the relationships between writers' rooms and caregivers that might be useful to others looking to enter into that work?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I'll keep it short, and I'll try to kind of, obviously it's hard to think about like building these relationships with people who are in writers' rooms or people who are like producers or people who are at that level of influence. It's not something that's like we all have these numbers on speed dial. So, to build on something that Janelle mentioned, I think one of the really, really great ways to get in the door is to sort of start doing social media campaigns. So, for example, if there's a show that is coming out that is like the second season of a show that builds on themes that your organization is really connected with, it would be great to organize, for example, like a Twitter storm or a Twitter chat that coincides with the premiere of the show. You bring in sort of voices from your community that have like stories to share. You bring in like collaborators and partners and do kind of a Twitter storm that coincides with the premiere. And so that does two things. It like obviously engages fans of the show who are already paying attention and they're online tweeting, but it also potentially could get the publicity and social media team of the show paying attention to you because you created a buzz. And that's why I recommend doing like a Twitter chat or a Twitter storm, because then you've already created this like buzz and they pay attention to you. One other quick thing I would say is, in order to do any of this pop culture work, even just having somebody on your social media team or your social media person paying attention to pop culture trends and paying attention to the shows and like speaking that language, I think it's important to say that like all of this requires capacity and infrastructure. And so I say like one first step to even doing this work and starting to build a voice and the relationships is to like make sure that we're investing in that capacity on our social media team, on our comms team, or even like building a culture change strategy, even just sort of starting to invest in that, because I think, this is work that takes time and research, and having somebody that's like tapped into pop culture trends, whether it's influencers or shows, and getting kind of working through that way to kind of get the attention of like the people who are actually telling the stories. And one last thing I would say, just from my experience, is I think if you're beginning to engage shows, I think there's like, there's multiple approaches on Twitter. You can do the carrot approach or the stick or both, in terms of like calling out things that may not be so great about a show versus uplifting the things that are great about a show. And I'd say if you're beginning to implement these strategies, like, then the carrot approach is usually the way to go, just in the beginning at least. That's not to say that there's not a lot of stuff about these shows that could be better, but just on a practical level, to start building these relationships, I would say that like the carrot approach, in my experience, has been sort of a more useful one.
Terrific. Thank you. It sounds like social media is a big, big part of this.
Definitely.
Yeah, definitely. Joyce, your work within working films, I think, is another powerful example. Excuse me, I had to cough and mute my phone, of using hybrid pop culture strategies. So I'm wondering, can you tell us a little bit about Story Shift and maybe how it challenges the assumptions about the ways that art is made?
Sure. Could I have the next slide, please? Hi, everyone. Thanks to Opportunity Agenda for having me and Working Films and Story Shift's work on this. It's exciting to hear all the stuff going on. So a little bit about Working Films. Working Films, which I just joined in 2016, late 16, but it's actually a 19-year-old, almost 20-year-old organization that's been using documentary film and increasingly other forms of storytelling to advance stories through social and environmental justice. So, for many years, Working Films has been using documentaries to address economic, racial, social, and environmental issues, and thinking about their different campaigns that they've done over time. It was mentioned before, Shore Stories. There's been other campaigns around other issue areas. It seemed increasingly important to look at intersectional approaches, and they became familiar with the Just Transition movement, and through that work that they were doing in becoming acquainted with that movement, we got to meet each other. I have been working in the climate justice movement for several years. I had been coordinating a coalition of 96 organizations across the Gulf Coast galvanized in the wake of the BP oil disaster, and had also become familiar with the Just Transition framework. And so they started, at that point, it was called the Just Transition Media Project, brought me on board, and actually working, Opportunity Agenda has a place in this story because we really got to know each other at the Creative Change Retreat in 2016. And this project was in development. And on this one slide, you see the real launch of this project, as a matter of fact, was the precise moment that Donald Trump came to office. That was kind of our first real big call and planning session for the summit that brought together a variety of leaders. Next slide, please. A variety of leaders in sort of similar formations of bringing together people, kind of how creative change brings together people through the Opportunity Agenda. I had met a bunch of the collaborators who are now part of Story Shift in different formations of organizing that has happened through centering art and culture. So the movement generation had brought together a group of folks, you see in the picture there. On the right-hand side, a bunch of the collaborators were brought together at that particular retreat to build relationship, to get folks who are doing artists who are doing work at the intersections of activism, social justice, and honing their craft and being high quality work. So that, bringing people together in person to build, to strategize, to think together was kind of where this project started. And there was a summit that was convened in North Carolina. We brought together artists, activists, leaders in Just Transition. And the whole framework of Just Transition is talking about moving from extraction to regenerative and sustainable economies, and economies meaning the management of home. And in that process, the very first thing that came up is you can't talk about creating media, creating art around these issues, the intersectional issues of social justice, without talking about how a lot of forms of storytelling, documentary film, Hollywood, is inherently extractive. And so if we were going to do this project and we were going to do it right, we needed to be grounded in a set of principles and praxis that is inherently non-extractive. And so next slide. we came up with a set of principles and practices that was co-created by kind of the initial advisory group, who I'm very grateful to for collaborating on these kind of big ideas that we feel within each, as we move forward in an emergent and iterative way, we can really build with our communities, with people on the ground to be accountable and really dig into these ideas of community collaboration, where we make sure that storytelling is developed by or in partnership with those whose experiences are being shared. So, centering creative collaborations around communities who are being impacted directly by the issues that are being discussed, and not taking images, not taking stories without accountability to the folks whose stories are being shared, and intentionally supporting queer, disabled, Black, Indigenous, people of color, and women in being media makers and storytellers of their own stories. And while doing that, we believe that we can, even if you're not a person coming from the community whose story is being told, you can be accountable to that. And so we're exploring those ways of what deep partnership looks like. We're also looking at honoring the journey and respecting many traditions. So a lot of times in movement building work, there's a lot of challenges, there's a lot of issues, and a lot of times there are voices that are left out and parts of the story that are left out. And we feel like in this moment of time, we need to be really honest and tell the stories as they are, as messy as they are, while honoring our ancestors, thinking about our future generations, and not, just telling one form of story. We can use many forms of story. So again, Working Films has been grounded in documentary film, but as we are developing Story Shift, we're looking at how can you use film, but integrate film and also use other forms of storytelling like animation, ceremony, dance, documentary films, fiction films, multimedia pieces, transmedia pieces, music, performance, rituals, songs, stories, circles, theater, virtual reality, augmented reality. There's so many ways we can tell stories. And so to really think about all the multiplicity of options that are in front of us, both in terms of the types of storytelling we can tell and the stories we tell, and resisting hero narratives, resisting one story or two stories that just kind of create more division. How do we look at multiplicity of truths in terms of kind of decolonizing praxis, like decolonizing away from our idea that there's only one way, there's only one leader, there's, I think that a lot of those things have been harmful for true justice in our communities. So that's a lot of what this project is grounded in. And so as we're building, we're building through accountable partnerships, multimedia storytelling projects, we're developing curriculum, we're looking at trainings, workshops, screenings, convening more summits, bringing people together in person to kind of develop and deepen the capacity of our communities to tell their own stories, while also leveraging pop culture, leveraging all the things that I think have been discussed on this webinar to this moment. Next slide. And so in this work, we are kind of centering in place in order for us to really deepen our understandings and deepen what we mean by intersectional storytelling in place. And the places we're looking at are working with are Gulf South, Puerto Rico, and North Carolina. And in each place, we have anchoring community networks and organizations and storytelling kind of collaboratives. And so in the Gulf South, there's another Gulf is Possible, which is actually a group that I'm also part of. And what we're doing is looking at using not just one form of story. Again, we're centering film, and we are actually producing, curating, commissioning new content that is directly accountable to and being requested by the communities whose stories, again, are being shared for kind of getting folks to understand what just transition is. We're also looking at other modalities. So one of the pieces that's been commissioned for Story Shift, through Story Shift for Another Gulf is Possible, is an animation. It's a really high quality animation that's going to launch as part of a big campaign that we're going to be starting in August. And also in that campaign is actually synergizing with mass mobilizations and direct actions that are happening in tandem with the Global Climate Summit and a bunch of things happening in California. So kind of how can we tell stories on the ground in the moment in places that are being directly impacted by climate, as opposed to kind of more theoretically discussing it, grounding it in place during these times of mass mobilizations. Next slide. And we'll be kind of closing that tour, which is the Stories for Survival tour in Puerto Rico around the 1-year observance of Maria, again, in deep collaboration, taking leadership from the ground, from the folks, from what they're doing. I don't even exactly know what we're going to do, but we're going to support folks in a way that, again, is in alignment with these principles. Defend Puerto Rico is one of our core partners there, who are doing transmedia work across multiple platforms to tell the story from the ground in an artist as first responder during just recovery. Like, we're trying to see if there's a way for this disaster that has just happened in Puerto Rico. Does it have to go the way that things went in New Orleans, for example? We believe there's another way, and we want to support each other across these places through stories and through trainings and through relationship building, to amplify the power of not just kind of adult voices, but also youth voices becoming increasingly clear that we want to center as we move forward in this work. Next slide. And so, just to close, I think Story Shifts, kind of the biggest things we're trying to do is amplify, resource, and support frontline communities in ways that are tangible, visible, real, can really be building capacity, but also building the choir. Like, a lot of times there's a very insular nature of the work, and we really feel like in order to get the critical mass and the change that we need these tipping points, and these tipping points will happen if we are starting to change the story that we're telling ourselves, so that the stories that are actually happening in our lives change at the same time, with a frame of accountability and abundance, and just kind of eliminating our concept that there isn't enough, that there is enough, we are enough, and that we just need to manage our resources of home in a way that is accountable and abundant for all. So thanks, y'all.
Thank you, Tracia, very, very much. That was great. We only have about maybe 8 minutes left. So I want to open it up to questions. Tracia, what tips, I think, can you give advocates and artists who want to make pop culture content in partnership, with directly impacted communities? I mean, is there any advice that you'd give them?
Yeah, I mean, I think this idea of bringing people together in person, I know it's funny to say that when we're on an online webinar, but I do feel like starting small in ways that, Adrienne Marie Brown's awesome book, Emergent Strategy, is very clear that, if you start with small interactions, those small interactions can lead to tremendous change. So a tip I would have is not to be overwhelmed by, there's so many possibilities, but if you find one place, find one partner, start something, start conversations, and from there see what emerges, and be led by vision, right? Be led by vision, and this idea, really, how much I can't impress enough, this idea of abundance and thinking in ways that are not limiting our vision, and because of the current conditions. This, the name of this webinar is Future Over Fear, and we really need to embody that in ourselves. And so to start with small interactions with vision and hope. It's kind of a not super tactical, but I feel like that we need to embody that energy. So
great, thank you. We have one question from the audience. This is the issue that. See if I can open it up here. How are you gauging the success of your work? Like, is there a specific metric or set of metrics that you use to sort of measure mind being changed? And how do you set your baseline metrics?
That is a really good question. I think so. I'm guessing when you say for my work, the question was specifically around the work engaging the entertainment industry, and I think so that's how I'm going to answer it. Anyway, I think one of the things that we're doing is partnering with a lot of the academic institutions and the different organizations that Janelle mentioned that are actually doing including the opportunity agenda, that are doing like studies on the ways that different issues and communities are currently represented on television shows. And so one of that helps us have like some baseline. So for example, the opportunity agenda did this report on the way that immigrants are represented on television. And so that gives us a baseline on that issue. The Norman Lear Center is another place that does a lot of research around that, as does around different issues and how they're represented on TV. And so I think one of the ways in which we can at least have a sense of like representation and how that might be changing is through partnering with these different academic institutions that are studying. They're both studying like current representation, but they're also studying the impact of specifically media on groups of people around different issues. So I know that's like a very sort of broad answer to your question, but since the work with television is like, we don't have a direct connection to the audiences that are watching those shows, barring this work that's being done by big academic institutions around media impact. That's really the way that that we gauge impact over time. And just to state that this is not something that changes in like a one-year period. Clearly, changing people's attitudes and behavior is like our like generational sort of goals. They're not things that happen in like a 1 to 2 year period. So we look at representation in like shorter periods, and then we work with these academic institutions to do studies about how media kind of impacts people around different issues and communities.
Perfect, thank you. We have a question here from Justine from, I think it's San Francisco Film. I hope I got that right. We're developing, this question is for either or both. We are developing toolkits for our filmmaking grantees to help them talk about their work as it relates to social justice issues in their films. So any specific resources or tips that you guys can point us to? Can we reread the question? It's for either.
I mean, I for myself, you know, there's the principles and practices that I referenced that lives online. I guess, but I just wonder what kind of resources is it that I have a question back, so I'm not very helpful of
okay.
Toolkits for developing analysis. There's so many. So
yeah. Ishita, anything? Do you want to comment?
I guess one of the things I would say, I'm not fully sure I understand. It depends a lot on the types of films, but there's actually some really cool toolkits that do exist that are about leveraging documentary films. That are about leveraging documentary films to actually organize folks to do like grassroots organizing work. Caring Across Generations, we worked on a documentary called Care, which came out last year, and we actually worked to create toolkits for our field partners on the ground to use the film to organize communities around the issues of aging and caregiving. So I'm happy to sort of share that. I know we're kind of running out of time, but there's some really great existing toolkits that can be used as models if it's documentary specifically.
Terrific. Thank you very much. We have a minute left. I think we are running out of time. I want to say thanks again to Janelle, Ishita, and Joysha for sharing their knowledge with us today. If you have any questions about today's material, please feel free to reach out to me or Elizabeth Johnson. Send you the invite. We're also sending you the link to this recording as a follow-up, so you can all share with any colleagues that couldn't make it today. One last thing, as you close out the webinar, a short evaluation is going to pop up. So I'm asking you to please fill that out so we can make sure we're offering the best possible content to our partners in the future as we do this go forward. So again, thank you to the speakers, and everyone have a great day.